Little girl was forced to marry a giant cowboy, but a week later she discovered who he really was. It was June 1879 in the scorching Texas territory, where dust danced with the wind and every sunset carried secrets of the Wild West. 16-year-old Clara May stood at the edge of Dust Creek, staring at the old wooden chapel where her life was about to change forever. She had lost her parents to bandits months ago, and her greedy uncle sold her off to a man twice her age, a giant, quiet cowboy named Jed Coulter, feared by most, known by all. They called him the Giant of Dust Creek, a man whose silence was heavier than a gunshot. Clara's heart pounded as she was forced to marry him, her tears mixing with the desert dust. But beneath that cold stare, Jed hid something far deeper than cruelty. In just 1 week, Clara would learn that the man she feared the most was not her enemy, but the key to the mystery behind her family's death. The church bells echoed through the still air as Clara May's trembling hands clutched the edge of her faded dress, her breath shallow beneath the heavy silence that filled the small wooden chapel. The scent of dust and old wood lingered, mixing with the faint perfume of wilted wildflowers scattered across the aisle. Her uncle stood near the door, his hat pulled low, refusing to meet her eyes after selling her future to pay off his gambling debts. The townspeople watched quietly, their whispers floating like smoke, pity in some faces, curiosity in others. At the front stood Jed Coulter, the man she was being forced to marry, tall as a mountain, his broad shoulders shadowing the flickering candlelight. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone, his rough hands folded before him. When the preacher's voice trembled through the vows, Clara's lips could barely form the words her voice lost to fear. Jed only nodded once, silent, accepting her as his wife with no emotion in his eyes. As the rings were exchanged, she felt the cold metal tighten around her finger like a shackle, binding her to a life she never chose. The crowd murmured blessings, though none dared approach the couple. Outside, the sun blazed across the dry land, and Clara's heart ached as she walked beside the stranger who was now her husband. The wagon ride to his ranch was long and quiet. Every creak of the wheels sounded like a question she couldn't ask. She tried to glance at him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road, his jaw clenched beneath the shadow of his hat. When they reached the small ranch house at Dust Creek's edge, the wind howled across the plains, and a single horse neighed in the distance. Inside, the home was simple but cold. No laughter, no warmth, just a bed, a table, and the faint smell of gun oil. Jed spoke only once, telling her where she could sleep, then stepped outside into the dark, leaving her alone in the silence. That night, as the wind pushed against the thin walls, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy with confusion and fear. She wondered what kind of man he really was, why he agreed to marry a girl he didn't know, and why his silence felt less cruel than broken. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, and she thought she heard the low murmur of a man's voice outside speaking to someone unseen. Her heart raced, but she didn't move. She pressed her hand against the ring on her finger, its weight reminding her that her life was no longer hers to control. Yet deep inside, beneath the fear and bitterness, a strange thought began to grow. What if this marriage, forced and unwanted, was hiding something she was never meant to discover? What if the giant cowboy she was made to fear was guarding a secret far more dangerous than his silence? The days that followed were slow and silent, filled with the kind of emptiness that made every sound sharper and every second longer. Each morning before the first light touched the desert, Jed would rise without a word, pull on his worn boots, and leave on horseback, disappearing into the endless stretch of red sand and dry wind. Clara watched him from the window, his figure fading into the horizon, a shadow swallowed by the dawn. He returned every evening, coated in dust, his face unreadable, his eyes distant as if burdened by thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. He never asked her anything, never raised his voice, never smiled, and that quietness felt colder than anger. She cooked, cleaned, and tried to fill the silence with the sound of her own breathing, but even the walls seemed to echo with questions she couldn't answer. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, she noticed the corner of a folded paper sticking out from under Jed's bed. Curiosity burned stronger than fear, and with trembling hands she pulled it free. It was a map, old and marked with red ink, leading somewhere deep beyond Dust Creek. Her heartbeat quickened as she traced the route with her finger, noticing small symbols beside certain places, crosses and circles, written initials she didn't recognize. She quickly slid it back before he returned, pretending nothing had happened, but her mind refused to rest. That night, as she placed his washed shirt near the bed, a second discovery froze her in place. Hidden beneath a pile of tools was a small box containing letters stamped with an official seal of the government, each one addressed to someone named J. Coulter, marked confidential. Clara's hands trembled as she read fragments about tracking movements, secret operations and missing witnesses. The words made no sense, yet they whispered danger. Beneath the letters, she found something even stranger, a silver locket engraved with the initials ML. When she opened it, a faded photograph of a woman appeared inside, her face kind but unfamiliar. A sudden sound at the door made Clara flinch, her heart racing as Jed's boots thudded across the porch. She quickly hid everything and sat by the table pretending to mend a torn sleeve. When Jed entered, he looked at her for a moment longer than usual, his expression calm but his eyes dark, as though he knew something had been touched that shouldn't have been. Without a word, he removed his hat, washed the dust from his hands, and sat in silence as the fire cracked beside them. Clara could barely eat, her thoughts tangled between fear and curiosity. Who was the woman in the picture? Why was Jed receiving secret letters from the government? And what was he doing in the desert every morning? That night, sleep refused to come. The air felt heavier than before, the house quieter. And in the darkness, she realized that the man she was forced to live with might not be what he seemed at all. The night the truth began to crack open. The sky over Dust Creek turned black with thunder, and rain poured like a curtain between the world and the heavens. Clara lay awake, her heart restless as the storm roared against the thin walls of the ranch house. She heard the floorboards creak, soft and careful, followed by the faint jingle of Jed's spurs. Through the small window, she saw him walking toward the barn, a lantern in one hand, his figure ghostly in the flashes of lightning. Something deep inside told her to follow. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped into the storm, her bare feet sinking into the mud as she moved closer, every gust of wind pushing her forward. The barn doors were slightly open, and she peeked through the crack, her breath catching as she saw Jed standing with another man cloaked in black. The stranger's face was hidden beneath his hat, but his voice was sharp, quick, and filled with urgency. Between them lay a small wooden box and a few papers soaked from the rain. Clara strained to hear their words through the thunder, catching fragments that made her blood run cold. Protection, the girl, and they know where she is. Her hands trembled as she realized they were talking about her. The man in the black coat handed Jed a sealed envelope before glancing toward the house, as if sensing her presence. Jed's voice, low and steady, replied, "I'll keep her safe. No one will touch her as long as I'm breathing." The man nodded once and disappeared into the storm, leaving Jed alone beneath the dim glow of the lantern. Clara stumbled backward, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Panic took over as she turned to run, her feet slipping in the mud. She rushed back toward the house, her mind spinning, thinking of the letters, the map, and the photograph. Before she could reach the door, a shadow moved behind her and Jed's voice broke through the rain, calm but firm. "Clara, stop." She froze, unable to speak, her throat tight with fear. He stepped closer, water streaming down his face, his eyes no longer distant but heavy with something she couldn't name. "You saw, didn't you?" he said quietly. She nodded, her breath shaking. He looked toward the barn, then back at her. "You deserve to know the truth." Inside, by the flickering firelight, Jed removed his soaked coat and sat at the table, his hands clasped as if holding something fragile. Clara stood still, afraid yet desperate to understand. His voice softened, carrying the weight of years. "I'm not just a cowboy," he began. "I was sent here to find the men who killed your parents. They're coming for you, Clara. The marriage, it was the only way I could keep you hidden." The room fell silent except for the rain tapping against the window. Clara's eyes filled with tears as the fear that had once chained her began to twist into something else. Shock, disbelief, and a flicker of trust she didn't expect to feel for the man she once thought was her captor. Jed's words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and unshakable, and for a long moment Clara couldn't move, her mind trying to make sense of what she had just heard. The firelight flickered across his face, showing lines of exhaustion and truth that no lie could hide. His voice, usually so quiet, now carried a calm strength that drew her in despite her fear. He told her how months before he arrived in Dust Creek, he had been tracking a gang known as the Black Vultures, the same men who had raided her family's farm, killing her parents and leaving her for dead. Clara's stomach tightened as the images of that night came rushing back. The smoke, the screams, and the smell of burning wood. Jed explained that after the attack, word spread that one child had survived, and the outlaws were hunting her to erase every witness. When her uncle's gambling debts grew, the gang used it to their advantage, offering him money in exchange for handing her over. Jed had been sent by the federal marshal to intercept that deal before it happened, but to keep her protected, he needed a reason the gang wouldn't question. Marriage was the only way to hide her in plain sight, to make it seem like she belonged to him, out of reach from anyone who might come looking. Clara stared at him, the storm outside fading to a soft rumble, her heart torn between anger and gratitude. She wanted to hate him for not telling her sooner, but deep down she knew he had saved her more than once without her even realizing. He pulled a small badge from his coat, dull from years of use, and placed it on the table between them. "I'm a federal agent, Clara. Every mile I ride, every secret I keep, it's for justice and for you," he said, his tone low but steady. The badge glimmered under the firelight like a promise. Clara felt the world tilt, the ground beneath her shifting as she finally saw him not as a stranger, but as the only person standing between her and death. Tears welled in her eyes as the walls around her fear began to crack. Jed looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time his expression softened, the edge of guilt fading into something gentler. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered. "I only wanted to keep you alive." She nodded slowly, her voice breaking as she said, "You should have told me." He gave a small, sorrowful smile. "If I had, you wouldn't have believed me." Outside, the wind quieted, and inside, the silence no longer felt cold but fragile, like peace waiting to be broken. In that moment, Clara saw not a giant cowboy, but a man carrying the weight of her pain and his duty. The fear that had once filled her heart began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar: trust. The morning the gang came, the sky was red like fire and the earth trembled beneath the sound of galloping horses. Clara barely had time to breathe before gunshots shattered the quiet, and Jed was already outside, rifle in hand, shouting for her to stay low. The air filled with smoke and dust as bullets tore through the wooden walls, but Jed never stepped back. He fought like a man with nothing left to lose, shielding her with his own body when the outlaws broke through the fence. The last shot echoed, and then there was silence. Only the whisper of the wind and the sound of her heartbeat. Clara ran to him, her hands trembling as she pressed against the blood on his chest, begging him not to leave her. His eyes met hers, soft and calm, and he said, "You're safe now, Clara." As dawn broke, the light touched his face, and she finally understood that love had found her not in promises, but in sacrifice.